Today we're going to look at becoming a persuasive writer, and this is just a very high-level overview. Many of you have already taken Comp 4300. It's Persuasion and Social Influence. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you do, especially if you're going to go into public relations, business, strategic communication, professional communication, nonprofit leadership, any area where you're going to be writing or speaking in a manner that's seeking to influence others. Right? So it's going to give you the tools that you need in order to create the strongest campaigns that you can. But like I said, today we're just going to hit on the high notes. Okay. So when we think about public relations and persuasion, we can go back to the very, very fundamental idea of rhetoric, which is based on ethos, pathos, and logos. You've all seen this in your basic public speaking course and probably Com 1000 and other related courses. Ethos is source credibility. So who do we have positioned as the speaker or the figurehead of an organization in the case of public relations? Very, very important, especially in times of crisis, right? We want someone who is a leader in the organization, but can also portray warmth and expertise, right? Someone we can trust. Pathos is the emotional appeal, right? So I just acknowledge that in times of crisis, if we want to have someone speak to our stakeholders, I know I did this a number of times when I worked in the healthcare setting and there was an issue with the organization or within the community. We would typically have our chief nursing officer or our chief medical officer who tended to be a little bit warmer and more easy to relate to than our CEO go on camera to deliver the information. Because again, they were able to better make that emotional connection with stakeholders. And then finally, we have logos, or the logical argument. So is the information we're providing, is it rational? Does it make sense? Is it analytical? Is it based on fact, right? So all of this goes into the basic believability of a message. That is someone going to accept the message that you have created and disseminated to them, or because it's either lacking in source credibility, it doesn't hit the mark emotionally, or it seems illogical, or like the facts aren't quite correct, then you're not likely to persuade anyone. Right? So in public relations, your job is to influence. And that is in the form of relationship building and maintenance, in terms of providing education, in the terms of dispelling misconceptions, right? So all of the work that you do, whether it's written or whether it's oral or mediated, is going to be based on constructing persuasive, credible messages. Okay, a couple other theories here. Diffusion and adoption. This comes from the theory, the diffusion of innovation, which is a 5-step process that helps to show us how new innovations catch on, right? If they catch on. So if we think about, the example that comes to mind, a classic example is when they first started to create aspirin. And so they had individuals, drug representatives, go to different physicians' offices to give them trials, to tell them about the clinical results, to teach them how it could help their patients. There's an awareness stage, right? So we're letting someone know, hey, this new drug exists. We pique their interest. We let them know in clinical trials, these were the positive results. These are the symptoms that aspirin can help to manage. Trial. In this case, they actually left samples of aspirin for the physicians to use with their patients or to use personally. Right? So then the evaluation, after we've used this product, after we've had our patients use this product, did they like it? Did they not like it? Did it do what it said it was going to do? And then that leads to adoption. So there are a number of different factors that affect the adoption process. It can range from our personal beliefs. It can range from what we see our friends and family and colleagues doing. It can range from how accessible this product is. We can think about the cost, the time, how complex or simple it is. All of these things will impact whether it becomes, it hits critical mass, right? So that's the terminology used with diffusion of innovation. And all critical mass means is this product has made the cut. It's sticking around, right? It is able to sustain itself then. You might also think about the hierarchy of needs. You probably feel like Maslow, he pops up in every class that you take. I certainly feel like in every class that I teach, we're talking about Maslow. But it's a very, very basic way for us to think about our target publics. We want to make sure that first these lower level needs or psychological and safety needs are met. And then we can think about too, depending on what our product or service is or the entity we're representing, how we want to formulate our messages to touch on these, to acknowledge that we're meeting the safety need for you, right? We think about everything that has gone on with Flint and the water safety. So a lot of, if you're working on behalf of a filtration company, very timely and logical approach to use. If we're working for a company that does higher end products, so if we think of something like a handbag or anything with fashion, if we think about different types of sports shoes, right, that tend to be more expensive and individual preference, then we can touch on our target audience's social, ego, or self-actualization needs. Okay. Some other factors here that affect your persuasiveness in writing is one, have you thought about your audience? So a few minutes ago when we looked at media uses and gratification, we talked about different types of channels. And that's all we're saying here is, again, if we're trying to reach very, very young children, right, we're typically not going to be reaching them on evening shows, right? Or through other mediated contexts. They probably don't have their own phone yet. They're not spending as much time on the internet. So figure out who your audience is and what communication vehicles do they use. We also want to look and see, do we have an audience that's particularly active? Right? Are we reaching out to people who are highly engaged in a topic? If we're reaching out to people who are actively going through cancer treatment or are cancer survivors or thrivers, then they tend to be a more active audience. If we're reaching out to people on behalf of the U.S. Potato Board, right, a little bit less active, or more of a passive audience where they might hear this and basically eventually this information will set in. Our source credibility, we talked about that with ethos, logos, and pathos. This idea that when we have someone in front of us, we want to believe that they have some expertise, right? We want to believe that there's some sincerity there and charisma. And so this is a lot of times where we can look at sincerity and charisma in celebrity endorsements, but we think, is Tina Fey really an expert in hair dye? Not likely. But she's sincere, she's very charismatic, and in that way we can attach Tina Fey to a particular brand of hair dye or whatever other product she's working on behalf of and see it as being credible. Or at the very least, we tend to like it more if we like Tina Fey. I always want you to think about audience self-interest. We don't have a lot of time these days. We're bombarded with messages. And every time we read a message, we're attempting to figure out, how does this affect me? How does it affect my family? Can this better me? Is there any way this can hurt me? Right? We're always looking out for self. So as a public relations practitioner, as a professional communicator, if you are always seeking to answer that what's in it for me, if you do that ahead of time, you're much more likely to be successful in influencing your target. And finally, think about the clarity of your message. I want you to think about who you're writing to. right? I think about this every day. The way in which I talk about my research with students, for example, is going to be far different than when I go to my national convention and talk to my peers about my research. So I'm simply using different jargon because it's expected by the various audiences. That means that the information, the language that I'm using is going to match what my audience expects, right? So if I came and spoke to my peers at a conference in the same way I'm teaching an introductory leadership or public relations course, they're going to raise an eyebrow at me and wonder why I'm using that type of approach, that type of messaging. And vice versa, if I came in and started using the same language that I do with my peers in an introductory course, you're going to look at me and figure out, why is Dr. O talking to us this way? We're not understanding her message. Okay. Few other factors that I want you to be mindful of when you're doing persuasive writing. Obviously, we want to look for relevancy and placement of messages. So does that mean that we have capitalized on a holiday, on some type of event that's in the news? Also figuring out, where do I place this message, right? Symbols and slogans, again, if your organization has one, you would make sure that this ends up on every type of promotional material that you create as an organization. If you're a new organization, this can be helpful too. You want to put a lot of time and attention into it. You probably want to hold some interviews and focus groups. But if it's associative with what you do and it's recognizable, it's likely to be successful. Semantics is one that is really important. This is something that Microsoft Word, that spell check isn't going to catch for you. That when you put it into social media, it's not going to be underlined with a red squiggly, because this is making sure that you know the basics of writing. This means being a strong reader, a strong writer, making sure that you have proofing mechanisms built in. So the example here is accept and accept. You might think about R and R. So, right, if we accidentally use OUR when we mean ARE, that makes our organization look really bad and makes it look like we don't take our time, that we rush, or in the worst case scenario, that we're simply unaware, right? That we're making wrong choices. And finally, suggestion for action. A lot of people would argue this is among the most important things to consider in persuasive writing and any type of public relations you do. The idea is that if we do get through and we connect with a target stakeholder, if they are interested in learning more, if they want to sign up for an event, if they want to sign up for a program, then we need to make it easy for them. So now we can embed different links that take them to additional information. If it's something for, even on a billboard, for example, we're not able to click or directly relate with it, to directly engage with it, then we can use a really easy 1-800 number, like 1-800-WMU, something so it becomes very easy for them to remember how to take that extra action. Content and structure. These are just a variety of different tools that you can use to think about when you're crafting your messages. There isn't one that's better than the other. It depends on the audience you're trying to touch. It depends on their expectations, and it depends largely on the channel that you're using and the goals that you're seeking to fulfill in this particular campaign with this message. So drama, again, you might use a case study technique. So some might humanize the issue. This might be in terms of like a day in the life of kind of story, a feature story, for example. You might also think about doing a biop like, so figuring out who you can follow and showing the ins and outs of who they are and how they got to a particular position. That means that we probably will need some active readers already in order to go through something that is more in depth. We're also seeing drama quite a bit now in many of the smoking campaigns, the warning campaigns about smoking. So when we have people who are showing scars from surgery or showing their voice box or how to clean it out, right? They're humanizing the issue and they're doing that in a very dramatic fashion. Statistics can be very compelling. Numbers speak, right? Especially if we have high or low percentages based on what we're attempting to demonstrate, can be something that people remember. We can also do surveys and polls as a way to demonstrate how much recognition our organization has or a particular aspect of it. Examples. So this is something where we're able to show, and this kind of part and parcel with testimonials. So an example, a lot of times I think about, before and after products, right? So we might think about a weight loss pill. So the example, let's say we have Tina who feels she's overweight ahead of time after taking a certain pill for 6 weeks, then we see her after. So that's an example of how the product works. And it's also the testimonial. So being able to say, here's the before, then I use the product, and here's the after. And they do that as a way to establish credibility. Endorsements, right? Think about celebrity endorsements. This might also be when an organization becomes a sponsor of a particular event. So think about the upcoming World Cup. I believe that Coca-Cola is a huge donor or sponsor, so they endorse the Olympics. Emotional appeals are ways, and we've kind of talked about this in terms of drama, testimonials, examples. We can use fear. We see this most frequently in terms of health campaigns. So this idea that X percentage of men who aren't checked for prostate cancer by age 45 are likely to, to develop this disease or to not catch it in time. Fear arousals obviously have ethical implications. So you need to look and say, typically the litmus test of can we use this fear arousal? One, is it likely to motivate your audience? If it's too frightening, typically instead of generating action, we generate paralysis in our stakeholders. If I feel like you're telling me I'm doomed no matter what, or it's already too late because I didn't do X, Y, and Z, then I might likely never go have that preventative test done. But the other thing is, as long as it's true. So that's kind of the basic ethical litmus test is if you're using statistics that are true, they're grounded in fact, then we're likely to be able to feel comfortable ethically using that particular messaging approach. The other note I have here is it's very effective with facts and figures. I use that in my example about X percentage of men not having a prostate exam. Right, so we're able to demonstrate, one, it's based on research, which means that it should be done ethically and that it is true. But it also helps to generate that source of fear in the sense that, ooh, that's a percentage, that's a higher percentage I'm comfortable with, so I'm going to choose to get this preventative test. Persuasive speaking, this is one that can be more challenging. This is one that takes practice, and I want you to think about, especially when you're interacting with people from the media, whether it's traditional journalists or bloggers, you want to give choices that force specific responses, right? So you're developing patterns of yes with the audience, right? So we're asking questions again that we say yes. So we can, if we can say that, do you want to raise taxes or raise tuition? We recognize that people don't necessarily want to raise tuition, so it becomes easier for them to say, okay, I guess it makes sense that we raise taxes instead. really want you to seek commitment. Get commitment for some action. You don't need to decide today, but will you come to the following meeting next Thursday? Or may I have one of our sales personnel connect you later this week? Right? So it's this idea that we have someone committing. Basic tenet of persuasion, commitment and consistency. If we commit to something, we're more likely to follow through. Then finally, asking for more. It's this idea that we submit a complete program to management with all the bells and whistles, knowing that they're likely to reduce it. But it's much better to end up with more money in a budget than to not have enough, right? A lot of times individuals will do this in sales too. They'll start by selling you a full suit, and then it becomes easier to say, hey, do you want to buy this belt, or do you want to buy these shoes, or this pocket square, all of which are going to cost substantially less than the suit. But once we've already committed, let's say we're spending $300 on a suit, and saying $30 for for a tie and $100 for shoes, okay, in comparison, it doesn't seem like that much. Persuasion and propaganda. This is one where we always want to use persuasion. Persuasion is ethical. Propaganda is not. So I'm going to read this quote about propaganda to you, not because I don't think that you can read it, excuse me, but because I see it as being so important. Propaganda is the deliberate and systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Excuse me. What this is suggesting then is that the information the propagandist is using is solely for his or her direct profit. Okay. So again, in propaganda, we can think about this. Propaganda started with World War I, when the government was attempting to get American buy-in, so to make sure that they weren't sharing any secrets with people who were potentially spies or on competing sides. Also to get people to create freedom gardens, to grow their own food, and to help in the war effort. Right? So that's propaganda. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it always has a negative intention at the start, but it is a systematic manipulation of information. Typically, propaganda is based on fear, right? If you look at, you'll see in your COM 2500 class, the Intro to PR. If you've already taken it, you've seen this. I believe it's chapter 1 or chapter 2, the World War I propaganda photos. Or posters rather, where they actually use like an ape to looks like King Kong to frighten you about the enemy. So anyway, some ways that individuals will use propaganda can be this idea of plain folks. So politicians do this a lot by stressing their humble beginning. I came from nowhere and nothing, and look where I am now. Testimonial, again, think about how many celebrity endorsements there are. Most of them don't have any type of expertise. Bandwagon is this idea that everyone's doing it, right? Millions of Americans have already purchased X, Y, and Z. Card stacking is a selection of data to build an overwhelming argument on one side, right? So we're really saying that, well, you could make that choice, but I'm going to show you all of the reason, all of these statistics, all of these arguments why this particular approach is better. Transfer. So an example here, we just talked about Coke and their endorsement with the Olympics. The association with one thing will lead to buying your project. So corporations pay millions to sponsor Olympics, hoping it will translate into more customers. In glittering generalities, this is associated with like a certain cause or product, and typically with the abstractions like love, freedom, peace, democracy. So if you buy this, you're more likely to have love, or if you purchase this, you're on the side of freedom. So some of these, especially for looking at a testimonial, for thinking about our celebrity endorsement, these can be used in ethical ways. So they can bridge on persuasion, but they can also sway, especially for thinking about glittering generalities or card stacking, for example. That tends to be more in the form of propaganda. The ethics of persuasion here, what we're looking at is that persuasion is based on truth. It's not manipulative. It does seek to influence, but it seeks to provide credible information to allow a group of targeted individuals to make a decision. Right? We talked in the previous lecture about how we can do informational or awareness or action-based goals. Same thing here. We're providing the information and we're letting the target decide. Right? So we use the example about whether we should bake our food or fry our food for more of a nutritional benefit. That is based on truth, right? It's not a half truth. It is accurate. We're able to provide information that will support that. The other thing here is we want to make sure that the information we are distributing creates public trust, right? That we are looking at our stakeholders as trusted friends. These are people that we have a reciprocal relationship with. We do not want to lie to them. We do not want to mislead them. Or rather, we want to cultivate a sustained conversation with them. And the other thing here too is that we make sure that if we have our employer or a client, that they're not asking us to communicate in a way that goes outside of professional laws, state laws, national laws, or the public interest. What that means is you might have an employer or client who asks you to withhold a certain number or to frame a message in a certain way. And certainly a lot of times we will take that into account if it is ethical. But at the end of the day, if this is information that your employees need or your customers need or others in the community need in order to make sure that they can still trust us, that they're making ethical, well-informed decisions, then we need to provide that information. Okay, and the last thing we're going to look at is ethical advocates. So in public relations, you are an ethical advocate. So you're working on behalf of an organization or a client, but making sure that when you craft messages, when you hit send, when you publish, when you distribute or disseminate, however you choose to do it, that these messages aren't based on deception, that we haven't used such simple language, oversimplification, that our audience is making decisions based on half of the information. We're going to make sure that we don't distort the consequences, right? If someone needs to, and say we have someone who needs to pay a bill by a certain day, if the fine for that particular grievance is $30, we're not going to send out a message that says you're going to be asked to pay a $100 fee if it's not in this day, right? And there will be times that people will likely ask you to say, well, if we say it's $100, people are more likely to pay on time. No, that is unethical,